I am Zoya, 32 years old, and I spent my entire life trying to earn a place in a family that only saw me as a servant. The night before my medical school interview, I stood perfectly still as the acrid smell of bleach burned my lungs. My sister had just poured toxic chemicals all over my late grandmother's vintage blazer, the only piece of her legacy I had left. When my parents walked in, they did not scream at her. They told me to stop making a scene and handed me a $50 bill to buy something at Target. I took the cash. I packed the ruined blazer. And the next morning, I wore it to the interview anyway. When the dean of admissions looked at the bleached silk lining, his face went completely pale. He locked the office door and told me my parents had been hiding a $15 million secret. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to fight for your own worth against the people who were supposed to protect you. The sizzling sound of the yellow liquid eating through the heavy navy wool was louder than I ever would have imagined. It sounded like meat frying in a hot skillet. I stood in the center of the immaculate white marble kitchen of my parents' Buckhead estate, my hands trembling at my sides. The harsh chemical stench of chlorine instantly overpowered the scent of the expensive vanilla candles burning on the island. My younger sister Chloe tossed the empty bleach bottle into the stainless steel trash can with a heavy, bored sigh. She did not even look at the destruction she had just caused. Instead, she lifted her slender arms, carefully adjusting the custom lace sleeves of her designer blouse. She examined her fresh manicure, completely unbothered by the fact that she had just destroyed the most valuable thing I owned. "Oops," she said, her voice dripping with that manufactured sweetness she always used when she was being her absolute cruelest. "I guess you cannot go to that stupid medical school interview tomorrow, Zoya. Next time, do not leave your thrift store trash on the couch when Trent and I are having company over." I did not scream. I did not lunge at her. Years of surviving in this house had taught me that reacting to Chloe only gave her the ammunition she desperately craved. Instead, I moved forward and snatched the blazer from the marble counter. The wool was actually hot to the touch, where the chemical reaction was actively burning through the fibers. I clutched it to my chest, not caring that the wet bleach was seeping into my own shirt and stinging my skin. This was not thrift store trash. This blazer belonged to my late grandmother, Dr. Josephine Jefferson. She was one of the first black female surgeons in the state of Georgia. She wore this exact navy blazer when she fought her way into rooms that did not want women who looked like us. It was a mantle of excellence, a piece of living history, and the only tangible thing I had left of the woman who actually believed in my potential. While Chloe was handed luxury vehicles and $1 million wedding to her arrogant tech bro husband, I had been working grueling 60-hour night shifts as a lab technician at the local hospital. For 10 long years, I drew blood, ran centrifuges, and scrubbed test tubes while my friends were sleeping, all just to afford my medical school application fees and prep courses. I had sacrificed my 20s, my sleep, and my peace of mind to earn this interview at the Atlanta Medical Institute. I was going to wear my grandmother's blazer to carry her strength into that room. Chloe knew exactly what she was doing. She wanted to erase my confidence before I even walked through the door. Before I could formulate the words to tell my sister exactly what kind of monster she was, the heavy oak doors of the kitchen swung open. My parents, Patricia and Desmond, walked in. They were dressed in their usual evening attire, returning from some elite charity gala. My father looked sharp in his tailored suit, while my mother dripped in pearls and quiet judgment. They were the picture-perfect representation of Atlanta high society, projecting flawless grace to the outside world while nurturing a viper's nest behind closed doors. I looked at them, holding the dripping, ruined wool in my hands. The smell of bleach was suffocating in the enclosed space. I expected them to smell it, to see the damage, to finally look at Chloe and tell her she had gone too far. Instead, my mother let out a long, exasperated sigh. She did not look at the ruined heirloom. She looked at me with pure disdain. "Stop making a scene, Zoya," she said, crossing her arms over her silk wrap. "It is just an old jacket. You are 32 years old. It is time to give up this ridiculous medical school fantasy and actually do something useful for once." I stared at her, the betrayal hitting me so hard my knees went physically weak. My grandmother was her own mother, yet she dismissed the blazer like a dirty rag. You need to focus on helping Trent with his new health tech startup. My mother continued walking past me to pour herself a glass of sparkling water. Trent is building a real future for this family. He needs a reliable assistant to handle the administrative work, and you need a reality check. Family supports family. The sheer audacity of her statement made the blood roar in my ears. Trent was a mediocre white man who had married my sister for her trust fund. He had driven 3 previous startups straight into the ground, and my father had bailed him out every single time to protect the family image. Now they wanted me to abandon a decade of medical research and grueling night shifts to fetch coffee for a man who could not even code his own software. My father finally spoke. He did not look up from his smartphone. He simply reached into his leather wallet, pulled out a crisp $50 bill, and casually slid it across the marble island toward me. Go buy something at Target, he said, his voice completely devoid of emotion. And apologize to your sister for ruining the vibe in the house. Trent is expecting important investors tonight, and we do not need your negativity driving them away. I looked at the $50 bill sitting on the pristine counter. I looked at my father, who was already typing an email entirely dismissing my existence. I looked at my mother, who was sipping her water with an air of righteous indignation. And finally, I looked at Chloe, who was hiding a triumphant smirk behind her manicured hand. They were a united front, a solid wall of entitlement and cruelty that I was never going to break through. I had spent my entire adult life waiting for them to love me, waiting for them to recognize my hard work, waiting for them to see me as an equal to Chloe. But standing in that kitchen, inhaling the toxic fumes of my ruined legacy, the final thread of my desperation snapped. The realization washed over me cold and absolute. They were never going to change, and my loyalty to them was nothing but a chain holding me down. I did not argue. I did not cry. I reached out and picked up the $50 bill. I grabbed a clean kitchen towel and carefully wrapped my grandmother's dissolving blazer inside it, protecting what was left of the fabric. I turned my back on them and walked out the door into the cool Georgia night, leaving their perfect toxic world behind me. I was not going to Target. I was not going to apologize. I was going to walk into the admissions office tomorrow morning wearing the exact jacket they tried to destroy. And I was going to show them that you cannot bleach out a legacy. The morning sun hitting the massive glass facade of the Atlanta Medical Institute did nothing to warm the cold reality of my situation. I walked through the sliding double doors of the admissions building, hyper-aware of the toxic chemical scent of bleach that still clung to my skin. The bottom half of my navy wool blazer was a ruined landscape of violent burnt orange and sickly yellow blotches. The fabric was stiff and warped where Chloe had dumped the chemicals just hours before. I kept my shoulders pulled back and my spine perfectly straight. I was not going to let my sister or my manipulative parents take this moment from me. I had earned my place in this building through a decade of blood, sweat, and graveyard shifts. The waiting room was a sea of absolute perfection. Other candidates sat in pristine, tailored suits, nervously flipping through notes on their expensive tablets. When I took my seat, the whispering started almost immediately. A woman across from me discreetly slid her chair an inch further away, wrinkling her nose at the chlorine fumes. A young man to my left stared openly at the destroyed hem of my jacket before giving me a look of profound pity. I ignored them all. I closed my eyes and focused on the heavy silk lining resting against the back of my neck. My grandmother had worn this exact armor when she cut a path through a medical establishment that wanted nothing to do with a brilliant black woman from the South. I could survive a waiting room full of privileged medical students who had everything handed to them. When the administrative assistant finally called my name, her eyes darted to the bleach stains. Her professional smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I stood up, smoothed down the ruined wool as if it were spun gold, and followed her down the long carpeted hallway. The interview room was intimidating by design. Heavy mahogany walls, a massive curved desk, and a panel of 5 elite physicians seated like judges at a tribunal. At the center sat Dean Harrison, a distinguished African-American man in his late 60s with sharp, observant eyes and a demeanor that commanded absolute authority. As I walked to the center of the room and placed my portfolio on the podium, the physical reaction from the panel was impossible to miss. An older white doctor at the end of the table actually scoffed, tossing his expensive pen onto the wood. Another panelist flipped through my file with a deep, disapproving frown. They looked at me and saw a 32-year-old lab technician who could not even be bothered to dress properly for the most important interview of her life. They saw disrespect. They saw a woman who did not belong in their world. I did not give them the chance to voice their assumptions. "Good morning," I said, my voice projecting clear and unwavering across the room. "I will not waste your time apologizing for my attire. The damage to my jacket is the result of a recent and unexpected chemical spill, but I am not here to present my wardrobe. I am here to present a diagnostic algorithm that will reduce false negative rates in autoimmune blood panels by 27%. The older doctor who had scoffed leaned forward, his arms crossed defensively over his chest. "Miss Jefferson, this is a highly competitive institution. We expect our candidates to demonstrate a certain level of professionalism and situational awareness. If you cannot manage your personal presentation, why should we believe you can manage the rigorous demands of our clinical programs?" I looked him dead in the eye, channeling every ounce of grit I had built over the last 10 years. "Doctor, with all due respect, I manage the midnight to 8 morning shift at County General Hospital. For the last decade, I have processed thousands of blood panels, calibrated broken centrifuges, and identified critical anomalies that exhausted medical residents routinely missed. I wrote the code for my algorithm on a cheap notepad during my 15-minute break shifts at 3 in the morning. I am wearing this jacket because giving up and staying home was simply not an option. Professionalism is showing up and delivering excellence regardless of the obstacles thrown in your path. Now, if you will direct your attention to page 4 of my prospectus, I will show you exactly how my predictive model outperforms your current standard of care." For the next 20 minutes, I did not just present. I dominated the room. I broke down complex data sets, explained the biochemical markers. My algorithm targeted and answered every aggressively challenging question they threw at me without missing a single beat. I channeled every ounce of frustration, every sneer from my mother, every dismissive comment from my father, and every cruel prank from my sister into pure, undeniable brilliance. As I spoke, the atmosphere in the room completely shifted. The initial hostility dissolved into captive attention. The doctor who had criticized my appearance was now furiously taking notes on his tablet. Another panelist was nodding along, completely engrossed in the data models I was projecting onto the screen. I was not the family scapegoat in this room. I was a medical powerhouse, and they knew it. When I finally concluded my presentation, a heavy silence hung in the mahogany room. It was not the silence of rejection. It was the silence of profound, begrudging respect. I gathered my notes, placed them neatly back into my leather portfolio, and prepared to thank the panel for their time. "Wait!" The voice came from the center of the table. Dean Harrison stood up slowly, pushing his heavy leather chair back. He was not looking at my presentation slides. He was not looking at my impressive resume. His eyes were locked entirely on my collar. Where the bleach had eaten away the top layer of the navy wool near my lapel, a very specific custom-embroidered silk lining had been exposed. It featured a distinct geometric pattern woven with deep burgundy and gold threads. "Miss Jefferson," Dean Harrison said, his voice surprisingly tight and almost trembling. "Where exactly did you get that jacket?" The question caught me off guard. The other panelists looked at the dean in confusion, unsure why the head of the medical institute was suddenly fixated on my damaged clothing after such a rigorous academic presentation. I stood a little taller, touching the lapel defensively. "It is a family heirloom," I replied, keeping my tone respectful but firm. "It belonged to my grandmother. She was a pioneering surgeon right here in Atlanta. Dr. Josephine Jefferson." The name landed in the room like a physical blow. The older doctors at the table exchanged sharp, knowing glances. Josephine Jefferson was an absolute legend, a woman who had broken racial barriers and filed medical patents that completely changed the landscape of surgical diagnostics. But it was Dean Harrison whose reaction sent a cold spike of adrenaline straight through my chest. All the rich color drained from his face. He reached up with shaking hands and slowly removed his wire-rimmed glasses, staring at me, as if the floor had just opened up and swallowed the entire room. He looked closely at my face, tracing the line of my jaw, the shape of my eyes, recognizing the ancestral resemblance he had somehow missed on paper. He stepped around the heavy desk, completely ignoring the puzzled murmurs of his colleagues. He walked right up to me, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Josephine," he whispered, speaking the name as if saying a prayer. "You are Josephine's granddaughter." "Yes, sir, I am," I said, my confusion mounting into a sharp, creeping anxiety. "Dean?" Harrison shook his head, taking a stumbling step back, as if he had been physically struck by my existence. He looked at me with a mixture of absolute horror and deep, profound grief. "But that is impossible," he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that echoed in the silent room. "Your parents sat in my office. Desmond and Patricia Jefferson sat right in that chair and told the endowment board that you died 5 years ago." I stared at Dean Harrison as the air in the mahogany-paneled room suddenly grew thin. The words hung suspended in the space between us, heavy and suffocating. "Died 5 years ago." I repeated the phrase in my head, trying to force the syllables to make logical sense. My pulse hammered against my ribs, a rapid, frantic rhythm, but my exterior remained completely, entirely still. I did not gasp. I did not reach for the back of the chair to steady myself. A lifetime of surviving the Jefferson household had taught me how to lock my emotions in a vault the second a threat presented itself. Dean Harrison moved with a sudden, urgent purpose. He walked past me, his leather shoes silent against the thick carpet, and engaged the heavy brass deadbolt on the office door. The sharp click echoed like a gunshot. He then moved swiftly to his massive desk, his hands shaking slightly as he tapped the spacebar to wake his computer. He gestured for me to come around to his side of the desk. I walked over the bleached hem of my grandmother's blazer, brushing against my knees. The monitor glowed brightly, displaying the secure internal portal of the Atlanta Medical Institute Endowment Board. Dean Harrison entered his administrative credentials, navigated through a labyrinth of secure financial directories, and clicked on a folder bearing the name Dr. Josephine Jefferson. "Your grandmother was a visionary," he said, his voice low and tight with suppressed outrage. "When she passed away 12 years ago, she bypassed her son completely. She knew exactly who Desmond was. She left a $15 million trust, along with the exclusive intellectual property rights to her entire catalog of medical patents, directly to you. The trust was structured to unlock entirely upon your 30th birthday or upon your completion of a medical residency, whichever came first. The board was simply holding the assets in escrow." I stared at the screen. $15 million. The number was so massive, so entirely detached from my reality of microwave dinners and overdue electric bills, that it felt like a clerical error. I had spent the last decade scrubbing biohazard bins at 3 in the morning to afford basic textbooks. I had begged my father for a $500 loan to fix my car transmission 2 years ago, and he had laughed in my face, telling me that struggle builds character. He had been sitting on a fortune that legally belonged to me, but the money was not the most devastating part of the file on the screen. It was the intellectual property portfolio. I read the titles of the patents my grandmother had filed. They were the foundational diagnostic algorithms for identifying autoimmune irregularities. They were the exact blueprints Trent claimed to have invented last year. How did they access it? I asked, my voice terrifyingly calm. If the trust was in my name, the bank and the board would have required my physical signature to release the funds. Dean Harrison swallowed hard. His finger trembled as he double-clicked a scanned PDF document labeled Estate Transfer. "They did not need your signature, Zoya," he said quietly. "They only needed proof that the sole beneficiary was no longer living." The document opened on the high-definition screen. It was a State of Georgia certificate of death. I leaned in closer, my eyes scanning the harsh black type against the official watermarked paper. Name of deceased Zoya Monique Jefferson. Date of death, exactly 5 years and 2 months ago. Cause of death, severe blunt force trauma, secondary to a motor vehicle collision. Location, a small rural county 3 hours south of Atlanta. My father had signed the bottom line as the identifying next of kin. My mother had signed as the secondary witness. The sheer calculated brilliance of their crime hit me like a physical wave. 5 years ago, I was in the darkest place of my life. I had suffered a severe depressive episode brought on by the relentless emotional abuse of my family and the crushing exhaustion of my lab schedule. I had isolated myself, completely cutting off contact with everyone for nearly 6 months while I sought intense psychiatric therapy. I was estranged from my parents' social circle, entirely disconnected from the elite country club friends they paraded around with. I had been a ghost in my own life. They had used my darkest hour of isolation to legally slaughter me. They filed the paperwork in a rural jurisdiction where no one knew my face. They presented the forged death certificate to the endowment board, playing the role of grieving parents who had lost their wayward daughter in a tragic accident. As my next of kin and the executors of my grandmother's original estate, the rights and the capital automatically reverted to them. Dean Harrison reached for a box of tissues on his desk and held it out to me. His eyes were shining with unshed tears of profound sympathy. He expected me to break down. He expected the daughter of Desmond and Patricia Jefferson to collapse into a weeping, hysterical mess upon learning that her own flesh and blood had wiped her from the earth for a paycheck. I pushed the box of tissues away. My mind was no longer in the room. It was running a rapid, systematic audit of the last 5 years of my family's financial history, snapping every puzzle piece into its brutal, undeniable place. It all made perfect, sickening sense. 5 years ago, my father's real estate firm had been on the verge of total bankruptcy. Then, miraculously, he completely restructured his debts overnight. He bought my mother a brand new Bentley. He bought Chloe a custom-built mansion in Buckhead. Then came Chloe's million-dollar wedding. The imported orchids, the ice sculptures, the Vera Wang gown. She had paraded around like royalty, funded entirely by the blood money stolen from my grandmother's legacy. And then there was Trent. Trent, the arrogant, mediocre tech bro who had burned through 3 separate investors before miraculously launching his new health tech startup last year. He did not know the first thing about biomedical engineering. He could barely format an Excel spreadsheet. But suddenly he was pitching a revolutionary diagnostic algorithm to venture capitalists. My parents had not just given him my grandmother's money. They had transferred the proxy rights of her intellectual property to him. They gave my white brother-in-law the genius of a pioneering black woman, letting him package her brilliance as his own corporate innovation. The rage that ignited inside me was not hot or explosive. It was absolute freezing zero. It crystallized my spine and sharpened my vision until everything in the room came into hyperfocus. I thought about the $50 bill my father had slid across the marble counter just hours ago. He told me to go to Target. He handed me a $50 bill while he was sitting on $15 million of my money. Dean Harrison watched me, his expression shifting from deep sympathy to slight apprehension. He could see the structural change in my posture. "Zoya," he said, cautiously lowering his voice. "I have a legal obligation to report this to the federal authorities. This is grand larceny. This is wire fraud. Your parents have defrauded this institution and the federal government. I need to call the police right now." I looked at him, my expression hardening into stone. "No," I said firmly. He blinked, clearly taken aback. "Zoya, you cannot protect them. They destroyed your life." "I am not protecting them, Dean Harrison," I said, my voice vibrating with a dark, terrifying clarity. "If you call the police right now, my father will call his elite defense attorneys. He will tie this up in litigation for the next 10 years. He will claim it was a clerical error, a misunderstanding with the estate lawyers. He will play the victim to his high society friends, and he will use my stolen money to fund his own defense. I will not allow him the privilege of a courtroom battle." Dean Harrison crossed his arms, looking at me with a newfound respect. "Then what exactly do you want to do?" I looked back at the computer screen. I needed to see the exact wording of the intellectual property transfer. Trent was hosting a massive catered dinner this coming Sunday to secure a $20 million venture capital buyout from a billionaire investor named Mr. Sterling. Trent was going to sell my grandmother's algorithm to the highest bidder in front of the entire Atlanta elite. "I need you to print everything," I said, pointing to the monitor. "I need the forged death certificate. I need the original trust documents naming me as the sole beneficiary. I need the wire transfer records, showing exactly which accounts my father diverted the funds into." I need every single page of my grandmother's original patent filings with the Institute. Dean Harrison did not argue. He immediately routed the documents to his private secure printer in the corner of the office. The machine began to hum, spitting out page after page of undeniable federal evidence. I stood there, smoothing the ruined, bleached fabric of my blazer. Chloe had tried to strip away my confidence this morning. She thought ruining my clothes would keep me in my place, permanently subservient, permanently beneath her. She had no idea that her petty act of cruelty was the catalyst that led me straight to the weapon that would completely destroy her life. The printer finished its job. Dean Harrison gathered the thick stack of papers, slid them into a heavy manila envelope, and handed it to me. The weight of it felt incredible in my hands. It was the weight of justice. It was the weight of absolute power. "Are you going to be all right, Zoya?" he asked, his eyes searching my face for any sign of hesitation. I looked at the older physician, feeling a profound sense of kinship. He had known my grandmother. He knew the kind of fire that ran in my blood. "I am going to be perfect," I replied, sliding the envelope into my leather portfolio. "My brother-in-law is hosting an investment dinner this Sunday. He is planning to sell property that belongs to me. I think it is only right that the true owner of the company shows up to review the terms of the sale." The drive back to this Buckhead estate was a masterclass in compartmentalization. The heavy manila envelope rested on the passenger seat of my 10-year-old sedan. Every stoplight I hit was a glaring reminder of the $15 million my parents had stolen from me. I pulled through the wrought iron gates of my family property, the tires crunching loudly over the immaculate gravel driveway. The sheer scale of their stolen wealth was nauseating. The perfectly manicured lawns, the imported Italian stone fountains, the sweeping columns of the main house. It was a monument built entirely on my forged death certificate. I parked near the guest house, a glorified storage unit they allowed me to live in so they could maintain the illusion of familial charity to their country club friends. Walking toward the main terrace, I spotted Trent. My sister's husband was sprawled on a teak lounge chair by the infinity pool, wearing a tailored linen suit that probably cost more than my monthly salary at the hospital. He had a crystal tumbler of bourbon in one hand and his smartphone in the other. He looked up as my shadow fell across the sunlit pool deck. A lazy, arrogant smirk spread across his face as his eyes landed on the bottom half of my blazer, still stiff and violently discolored from Chloe's bleach attack. He let out a sharp bark of laughter. "Hey, Zoya," Trent called out, his voice dripping with that unbearable tech bro condescension. "Chloe texted me you actually went to the institute looking like a walking hazmat spill. I hear the interview was a total bust. Tough break. Maybe next time you will listen to your mother and learn when to fold a bad hand." I stopped at the edge of the patio. I did not look angry. I did not let a single ounce of the absolute hellfire burning in my chest show on my face. Trent was a parasite, a mediocre man playing a genius on my grandmother's dime. He stood up, setting his bourbon on a glass side table, and picked up a silver clipboard. "Listen, since your medical school fantasy is officially dead in the water, I need you to do something useful," he said, walking over and shoving the clipboard aggressively against my chest. "I need you to sign this tax waiver for the family LLC. It is just a routine dependent form. Your dad says we need it updated for the accountants so you can keep living in the guest house rent-free. Family supports family right." I took the clipboard. My eyes scanned the top of the page. It was formatted to look like a standard IRS disclosure, complete with boring boilerplate text about household dependence and shared financial liability. But I had spent the last decade reading complex, peer-reviewed medical journals and untangling dense biochemical data. My eyes naturally dropped to the second page, skipping past the distraction text and landing squarely on the legal clauses buried at the very bottom. There it was. It was not a tax waiver. It was a retroactive relinquishment of intellectual property rights. The document explicitly listed the exact patent numbers my grandmother had filed 12 years ago, the exact diagnostic algorithms I had presented to Dean Harrison just a few hours prior. The legal jargon was dense, but the objective was crystal clear. It was a binding agreement that would permanently sever any legal claim I might unknowingly have to the intellectual property, transferring all retroactive and future rights directly to Trent's startup Novatech. They were trying to plug the final hole in their sinking ship. "Mr. Sterling, the billionaire venture capitalist coming to dinner on Sunday was no fool. His legal team must have run a preliminary due diligence check on Trent's company and flagged a discrepancy in the chain of title for the algorithm. My parents had faked my death to get the trust, but to completely sanitize the corporate acquisition for a $20 million buyout, Trent needed a clean, undeniable waiver of rights from the original creator's bloodline, just in case a ghost ever decided to walk into a courtroom. They actually thought I was stupid enough to sign it without reading. They thought a lifetime of treating me like an incompetent failure had conditioned me to blindly obey their administrative demands. They assumed I would just scrawl my name on the dotted line out of fear of losing my tiny room in the guest house. I kept my face perfectly slack. I traced my finger over the signature line, feeling the smooth texture of the paper. If I signed this, Trent would walk away with my grandmother's genius $20 million of clean venture capital and the ultimate victory over my life. I looked up at Trent. He was tapping his expensive leather shoe against the pool deck, clearly impatient to get back to his day drinking. "Just sign the bottom line, Zoya," he sighed, checking his luxury watch with exaggerated annoyance. "I have a major investor dinner to prep for, and I do not have time to hold your hand through basic paperwork." I smiled at him. It was a slow, deliberate smile that did not reach my eyes. I handed the clipboard back to him, leaving the signature line completely blank. "I would love to get this sorted out for you, Trent," I said, my voice smooth and entirely compliant. "But the print is a little small, and I left my reading glasses up in my room. Give me an hour to get cleaned up and find them. I will sign it before dinner." Trent rolled his eyes in profound frustration, snatching the clipboard out of my hand. "You are unbelievable. 1 hour, Zoya. Do not make me come looking for you. We need this filed by tomorrow morning." I turned my back on him and walked toward the main house. The second I was out of his line of sight, my compliant posture vanished. I bypassed the hallway leading out to the guest house entirely. Instead, I moved silently through the heavy mahogany doors of the main corridor, stepping onto the plush runner rug that muffled my footsteps. I bypassed the grand staircase and headed straight down the West Wing corridor. I was not going to look for my reading glasses. I was heading straight for my father's locked home office. The mahogany doors of my father's home office were always locked. Desmond guarded this room like a fortress, a sacred space where the patriarch conducted the business that supposedly kept our family at the pinnacle of Atlanta society. But growing up in this house as the invisible daughter meant I knew things. I knew the heavy brass handle had a slight give if you lifted it upward while turning the spare key I had copied from my mother's master ring 3 years ago. The lock clicked. I slipped inside and eased the door shut behind me, plunging into the heavy silence of the room. The space was a monument to stolen money. Persian rugs, imported leather armchairs, and a massive oak desk that dominated the floor plan. Wall-to-wall bookshelves held first editions my father had never read and framed photos of him shaking hands with local politicians. There was not a single picture of me in the room. Chloe was everywhere, smiling in her graduation gown, posing in her $1 million wedding dress, laughing on the deck of a yacht. It was a shrine to his golden child, paid for by the ghost he had created. I stepped behind the desk and tapped the spacebar on his state-of-the-art desktop computer. The screen flared to life, demanding a password. My father considered himself a brilliant tactician, a man who outsmarted the system at every turn. But narcissists are inherently lazy, and their blind spots are always tied to their pride. I did not need to guess a complicated alphanumeric sequence. I typed in the 4 digits of Chloe's birthday, followed by the year she was born. The screen unlocked instantly. I pulled a high-capacity flash drive from my pocket and jammed it into the port. My hands were remarkably steady. The freezing calm that had settled over me in Dean Harrison's office had solidified into a laser-focused drive. I opened the main hard drive and began searching for the offshore holding accounts my father used for his real estate firm. It did not take long to find the rot. My father was arrogant enough to keep the files locally confident that no one would ever dare question the great Desmond Jefferson. I opened a folder labeled Estate Transfers, and there it was. The entire digital paper trail of my staged demise. I clicked through the scanned documents, my eyes absorbing the brutal reality of their theft. There was the forged death certificate identical to the one the dean had shown me. but here accompanied by the internal emails between my father and his corrupt legal counsel. The depth of the conspiracy was laid bare. I found the initial correspondence where my father instructed the lawyer to file the paperwork in a rural jurisdiction 3 hours south, specifically noting that no one there would ask questions about a prominent black family from Atlanta. Then I opened the financial ledgers. The Josephine Jefferson Trust had been systematically butchered. Row after row of spreadsheets detailed the transfer of $15 million into a web of shell companies. I watched my grandmother's life work transform into my family's luxury. There was the $200,000 wire transfer labeled Chloe Wedding Vendor. There was the $50,000 withdrawal marked Country Club initiation fee. I found the purchase orders for my mother's fleet of luxury vehicles and the invoices for the custom Italian marble surrounding the pool where Trent was currently sunbathing. But the most damning folder was labeled Novatech Seed Capital. I opened it and found the exact legal framework they used to funnel $5 million of my grandmother's money directly into Trent's failing hands. My parents had illegally collateralized this very mansion, backing the loan with the stolen trust funds to legitimize my white brother-in-law as a tech visionary. They had literally mortgaged their souls to give him my intellectual property. I highlighted every folder, every spreadsheet, every forged signature, and dragged them onto my flash drive. A small window popped up on the screen, calculating time remaining. The progress bar crawled forward, 10%, 20%. The file sizes were massive. High-resolution scans of legal documents and years of financial data took time to transfer. I stood frozen behind the desk watching the green bar inch across the screen, 35%. Then I heard it. Zoya. My mother's voice drifted up from the grand foyer downstairs. It was sharp, carrying that familiar tone of irritated impatience she reserved exclusively for me. Zoya, where are you? My heart hammered against my ribs. I stared at the screen. 50%. Come on, move faster. I heard the sharp click of Patricia's designer heels striking the marble floors of the entryway. She was moving toward the base of the main staircase. Zoya, Trent said you came inside an hour ago. Do not tell me you are hiding in your room sulking about that ruined jacket. We have caterers arriving in 2 hours for the investment dinner, and I need you downstairs to manage the delivery staff. 70%. The heels began clicking up the hardwood stairs. Each step sounded like a ticking clock in the silent house. My mother was not the type to call out and wait. If I did not answer, she would search every room until she found me ready to deliver a lecture on my lack of gratitude and poor work ethic. 85%. I am coming, Mom, I shouted back, pitching my voice to sound exactly like the subservient, defeated daughter she expected to hear. I just needed to use the restroom. I do not pay for the water in the guest house, so you can use the main bathrooms, she snapped back. Her voice was louder now. She had reached the second-floor landing. The West Wing corridor where my father's office sat was just a few dozen yards from the top of the stairs. 90%. I watched the screen with agonizing intensity. The green bar was practically crawling. My mother's footsteps turned down the corridor. She was heading straight toward the guest wing, which meant she had to walk right past the heavy mahogany doors of the office. 95%. If she caught me in here standing over my father's unlocked financial records with a flash drive, the element of surprise would be completely destroyed. Desmond would instantly lock down the accounts, call his crisis management team, and spin a narrative that I was trying to steal from them. They would bury the evidence before I could even make it to a lawyer. 98%. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Zoya, my mother called out, her voice muffled but dangerously close. The handle of the door rattled slightly. I held my breath, my fingers hovering over the flash drive. 99%. The computer chimed softly as the transfer completed. Transfer successful. I ripped the flash drive from the port and shoved it down into my bra, pressing the cold metal flat against my ribs. I swiftly tapped the screen, closing the financial folders and locking the computer back to its password-protected login screen. I grabbed a microfiber dusting rag from the top drawer of the desk, a prop I had brought in with me for exactly this scenario. The brass doorknob slowly began to turn. The heavy wood swung inward. Patricia pushed the door open, her posture rigid. her eyes narrowing suspiciously as they swept across the room and landed on me standing behind the massive oak desk. She was wearing a tailored silk blouse, her arms crossed tight against her chest. The irritation on her face instantly morphed into cold, sharp accusation. "Zoya," she demanded, her voice dropping to a dangerous register. "What are you doing in your father's office?" I kept my breathing entirely steady, relying on a decade of practice, hiding my true emotions from the woman standing in the doorway. I slid my hand down from my chest, ensuring the heavy flash drive was perfectly concealed beneath my bra wire, and held up the yellow microfiber cloth I had brought exactly for this moment. "Just cleaning the bookshelves, Mom," I said, keeping my voice perfectly flat and compliant. "Just like you asked." Patricia stepped further into the room, her designer heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Her eyes swept suspiciously over the mahogany desk, the locked file cabinets, and the dark computer monitor, before finally settling on me. The disdain on her face was palpable. She scoffed, crossing her arms over her pristine silk blouse. "I did not ask you to clean your father's private sanctuary," she said, her voice dripping with irritation. "You have absolutely no business being in this room. Your sister's husband is hosting a massive venture capital dinner on Sunday, an event that will actually secure this family's future. And you are loitering around dusting books you do not even understand. Get out of here right now and drive downtown. Trent needs the final tasting menus picked up from the caterers. And make sure you use the service entrance when you get there. I do not want you embarrassing us in front of the event staff looking like a complete disaster." She gestured vaguely toward my ruined, bleach-stained blazer, her upper lip curling in disgust. She had no idea that the very garment she was insulting had just unlocked a $15 million secret. She had no idea that the ghost she created 5 years ago was standing right in front of her, holding the digital keys to her destruction. "I will go right now, Mom," I said softly. I walked past her, keeping my head slightly bowed, playing the role of the defeated invisible daughter to absolute perfection. The moment I stepped out of the house and got into my 10-year-old sedan, the subservient mask completely evaporated. I locked the car doors, pulled the flash drive from my dress, and gripped it so tightly the plastic casing dug into my palm. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I started the engine and drove straight past the caterers, merging onto the highway, heading straight into the heart of downtown Atlanta. I was not picking up appetizers for the man who stole my grandmother's genius. I was going to see the one person in this city who possessed the legal firepower to help me burn my family's empire to the ground. Valerie Washington was a senior partner at one of the most ruthless corporate litigation firms in the Southeast. We had met 12 years ago at our historically black university, sharing a cramped dorm room and surviving on cheap coffee and sheer ambition. While I buried myself in biochemistry and medical textbooks, Val was a force of nature in the pre-law program, dismantling opponents in debate club with a terrifying, predatory smile. She was the only person who knew the truth about the psychological warfare my parents waged against me. I walked into her high-rise glass office building, ignoring the strange looks the receptionist gave my ruined jacket. When I pushed open the door to Valerie's corner office, she was on the phone, aggressively negotiating a contract. She took one look at my face, told the person on the other end of the line she would call them back, and slammed the receiver down. "Zoya," she said, standing up and walking rapidly around her massive glass desk. "What on earth happened to your jacket? Are you hurt?" "Chloe," I said simply. Valerie's expression instantly darkened. She knew exactly what that single word meant. She pulled me into a brief, fierce hug, then stepped back. "Tell me what those monsters did this time." I did not waste time with tears or long explanations. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the flash drive, and placed it directly onto her desk. "I need you to plug this into an encrypted terminal, Val, right now." Valerie did not ask any questions. She took the drive, plugged it into her secure laptop, and clicked open the main folder. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling window looking out over the Atlanta skyline, while the clicking of her mouse filled the silent office. For the first 2 minutes, Valerie said absolutely nothing. Then I heard a sharp intake of breath. The clicking stopped. "Zoya," Valerie whispered, her voice stripped of its usual unshakable confidence. "Please tell me I am misreading this document. Please tell me your parents did not file a certificate of death in your name." "They filed it 5 years ago in a rural county 3 hours south of here," I replied, turning to face her. They used it to bypass the escrow conditions on my grandmother's trust. They took $15 million, Val. They took the house, they took the cars, they funded Chloe's wedding, and they took the intellectual property rights to my grandmother's diagnostic algorithm. Trent is pitching it to a billionaire venture capitalist named Mr. Sterling this Sunday. They stole my life to fund his. Valerie stared at the screen, her dark eyes scanning the fraudulent wire transfers and the forged legal signatures. The shock on her face rapidly transformed into something much more dangerous. It was the look of a shark smelling blood in the water. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she opened spreadsheet after spreadsheet, tracking the money laundering, the collateralized loans, and the blatant intellectual property theft. They did not just steal from you, Zoya. Valerie said, her voice dropping into a deadly professional register. This is a highly coordinated conspiracy. They committed federal wire fraud, tax evasion, identity theft, and grand larceny. Your father used a stolen trust to secure a $5 million seed loan for Trent's company. This is a house of cards built on federal crimes. She turned the laptop screen toward me, pointing at the digitized signature of my father on the death certificate. We could call the FBI right now. I have contacts in the white-collar crime division. We can hand over this drive, freeze their bank accounts by midnight, and have federal agents kicking down the doors of that Buckhead mansion to put them all in prison by Tuesday morning. The offer was incredibly tempting. The image of my mother being led out of her pristine kitchen in handcuffs was a satisfying thought. But I remembered the $50 bill my father had slid across the counter. I remembered the smug, arrogant laugh Trent gave me by the pool when he tried to trick me into signing away my rights. I remembered the 10 years of agonizing graveyard shifts, the missed meals, and the crushing isolation I endured while they lived like royalty on my inheritance. I shook my head, feeling my expression freeze over into absolute ice. No. Valerie blinked, completely taken aback. Zoya, what do you mean no? They legally slaughtered you for a paycheck. You have the smoking gun sitting right here on my desk. If we just call the cops, they will play the victim, I explained, walking back over to her desk and planting my hands flat on the glass surface. You know exactly how my father operates in this city. He will hire the most expensive defense attorneys in the state. He will drag this out in court for 10 years. He will claim it was a massive misunderstanding by his accountants or a clerical error with the estate lawyers. He will spin a narrative to his wealthy country club friends that I am just an unstable, disgruntled daughter trying to extort money from her successful family. They will paint me as crazy, and they will use my own stolen money to pay for their defense. Valerie fell silent, processing my words. She knew the social dynamics of the Atlanta elite just as well as I did. She knew that wealthy people with the right connections rarely faced the swift, brutal justice they deserved behind closed doors. I lived as a ghost in that house for 10 years. Val, I continued, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. They want me dead on paper. I am going to show them exactly what a haunting looks like. I am not going to let them hide behind their lawyers or their high society reputation. I want to tear the foundation out from under them while everyone they care about is watching. Valerie looked at me for a long, quiet moment. The concern in her eyes vanished, replaced by a fierce, undeniable respect. She slowly closed the laptop, a brilliant, predatory grin spreading across her face. Trent is hosting that investment dinner on Sunday, I said, laying out the battlefield. Mr. Sterling is coming to finalize a $20 million buyout for Novatech. My parents have invited everyone who matters in their social circle to witness Trent's big success. They need that buyout to cover the massive debts they accrued funding his fake genius. That is when I want to strike. I want to trap them in a room with their investors and dismantle their entire empire piece by piece. Valerie leaned back in her ergonomic leather chair. She reached into her desk drawer, pulled out a fresh yellow legal pad, and clicked her heavy gold pen. If we are going to do this your way, Zoya, we cannot just rely on criminal charges, Valerie said, her mind already racing with legal strategy. We have to completely annihilate them financially before they even know they are under attack. Your father collateralized that mansion to get Trent's business off the ground. If we move fast, we can weaponize that debt against them. Tell me exactly what time this dinner starts. We have a lot of work to do. Valerie turned her monitor so I could see the screen. Her fingers flew across the keyboard as she pulled up the public property records for Fulton County. The digital footprint of my father's arrogance was laid out in stark black and white. Desmond Jefferson, the great Atlanta real estate mogul, had made a fatal miscalculation. To bankroll Trent's illusion of being a tech genius, my father had taken out a $5 million high-interest commercial loan. He collateralized the entire Buckhead estate, betting our family home on the assumption that Trent would secure a massive venture capital buyout within 6 months. He truly believed they could sell my grandmother's stolen diagnostic algorithm before the bank ever came knocking. But Trent was a fraud, and frauds bleed cash. He burned through the seed money hosting lavish networking parties, buying luxury cars, and maintaining the superficial lifestyle of a successful founder. The algorithm remained untouched because Trent did not actually know how to code a single line of medical software. When the cash dried up, the loan went into default. They had missed their last 3 payments. Valerie leaned forward, her dark eyes gleaming with predatory excitement. Banks despise toxic assets, Zoya. When your father defaulted, the bank quietly offloaded the bad debt to a private equity collection firm for pennies on the dollar. Your parents are currently sitting in a mansion they no longer own, hosting an extravagant dinner they absolutely cannot afford, praying this investor bails them out before the eviction notices arrive on their doorstep. I looked at the screen, the pieces of our strategy locking into a devastating sequence. "We are going to buy the debt," I said, my voice steady and certain. Valerie smiled her terrifying, brilliant smile. "With the verified documents from Dean Harrison, you now have full legal authority over the $15 million Josephine Jefferson Trust. We just need to execute a corporate buyout of the outstanding note from the private equity firm. We will use their own stolen funds to buy the ground right out from under their feet." The next 36 hours were a masterclass in aggressive corporate litigation. Valerie did not sleep. She leveraged every contact she had in the Atlanta financial sector, moving with lethal precision. She routed the transaction through a blind holding company to ensure my father's lawyers would not be alerted to the buyer's identity. I sat in her conference room drinking bitter coffee, reviewing the patent files and preparing the intellectual property injunctions that would permanently freeze Novatech. By Saturday night, the wire transfer cleared. The ink dried on the digital contracts. I owned the $5 million note. I held the deed to the Buckhead estate. My parents were literally trespassing in my house. Sunday afternoon arrived with the suffocating humidity typical of a Georgia spring. I drove my beat-up sedan back through the wrought iron gates of my newly acquired property. The estate was already swarming with luxury catering vans and valet attendants setting up for the evening. I parked near the guest house, completely ignored by the event staff rushing past me with massive floral arrangements and crates of expensive wine. I walked into my cramped, dimly lit room and pulled a plain black uniform dress from my closet. My mother had explicitly ordered me to wear it so I would blend in seamlessly with the hired help. She wanted me invisible. She wanted me to serve the very people who were actively trying to purchase my stolen legacy. I slipped the dress over my head, but before I zipped it up, I reached into my bag and pulled out a thick roll of medical tape. I took the heavy notarized legal documents Valerie had prepared for me. The federal intellectual property injunction, the cease and desist orders for Novatech, the authenticated deed of ownership for the estate. I folded them tightly, placed them in a waterproof plastic sleeve, and taped the rigid packet directly against my ribs. I smoothed the black fabric of my dress over the documents. They formed a literal armor of paper and ink pressing against my skin with every breath I took. I looked at my reflection in the cheap mirror on the back of my door. I did not see a victim. I saw an executioner. I walked across the manicured lawn and entered the main house through the service doors. The kitchen was a war zone of culinary chaos. The heat from the industrial ovens was intense, mixing with the rich scents of roasted garlic, seared beef, and expensive truffle oil. The catering manager was shouting instructions to a line of servers balancing massive silver trays. Suddenly, the swinging doors to the formal dining room burst open. Chloe strutted into the kitchen looking like she had just stepped off a high-fashion runway. She was wearing a stunning crimson evening gown that clung to her figure perfectly. Every thread of that dress, every diamond sparkling at her throat, had been paid for with my grandmother's stolen money. She stopped in the center of the kitchen, her eyes scanning the room until they locked onto my plain black dress. Her flawless face twisted into a mask of pure contempt. She marched over to the preparation counter, grabbed a heavy silver tray loaded with crystal champagne flutes, and shoved it roughly into my chest. I had to grip the edges of the tray tightly to keep the fragile glasses from shattering against each other. Trent's primary investor just pulled into the driveway. Chloe snapped, her voice low and venomous. Mr. Sterling does not tolerate distractions, and he certainly does not tolerate incompetence. This dinner has to go perfectly. She leaned in closer, her expensive floral perfume clashing violently with the heavy scent of cooking grease in the kitchen. She wanted to make sure I understood my place at the absolute bottom of her hierarchy. "Do not speak to anyone," Chloe commanded, jabbing her manicured finger against the edge of my silver tray. "Do not make eye contact with the guests. You are here to serve drinks and nothing else. And for God's sake, stay in the kitchen unless I specifically paid you to refill a tray. I will not have you wandering around looking like a miserable failure while my husband secures our future. Do you understand me?" I looked at my younger sister. I looked at the sheer arrogance radiating from her posture. I felt the rigid, heavy weight of the legal injunctions pressing against my ribs, a physical reminder that her entire world was about to collapse in spectacular fashion. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I let a slow, perfectly calm smile touch the corners of my mouth. "Do not worry, Chloe," I whispered, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of fear. "I am going to give everyone exactly what they deserve." I balanced the heavy silver tray of crystal champagne flutes on one hand, took a steadying breath, and pushed through the swinging kitchen doors. The immediate shift in the atmosphere was suffocating. The formal dining room was a cavernous space bathed in the warm golden glow of a massive tiered chandelier. My parents had spared absolutely no expense to create an illusion of unshakable wealth. The long mahogany table was set with heirloom silver imported silk napkins and towering centerpieces of white orchids that partially obscured the faces of the guests. The room was packed with the most powerful players in the Atlanta financial and medical sectors. I recognized hospital administrators, local politicians, and prominent real estate developers, all people my parents had carefully cultivated to validate their elite social standing. Sitting at the absolute head of the table, commanding the room with his booming voice, was my father, Desmond. He was holding a glass of scotch, regaling the captive audience with fabricated stories about our family history. "We built the Jefferson family legacy on the foundational belief that excellence is not simply a goal, it is a genetic requirement," my father announced. His chest puffed out with unearned pride. He gestured expansively around the opulent room. "It takes generations of uncompromising brilliance to build a foundation this solid. We demand nothing but the absolute best from ourselves and from the people we bring into this family." He smiled warmly at Trent, who was seated immediately to his right in the position of honor. Trent grinned back, looking every bit the arrogant, entitled white tech executive who believed he had single-handedly conquered the world. Sitting directly across from Trent was Mr. Sterling, the billionaire venture capitalist. Sterling was an older man with sharp, predatory eyes that missed nothing. He was not smiling at my father's grand speech. He was quietly cutting his steak, listening and calculating. He was a man who lived and died by the authenticity of his investments, and he was currently sitting in a room entirely constructed of lies. I kept my eyes lowered, molding my posture into the subservient, invisible shape my parents expected of me. I stepped up to the long table and began methodically replacing empty water glasses and serving champagne. I could feel the stiff, rigid edges of the legal injunctions and property deeds taped tightly against my ribs beneath my plain black uniform dress. Every time I inhaled, the paper pressed into my skin, a secret, indestructible armor shielding me from the toxic energy of the room. As I moved behind my mother's chair to refill her glass, Patricia reached out and placed a manicured hand over her crystal goblet, stopping me. She did not look at me directly. She turned her head slightly to engage the wealthy senator's wife seated next to her, deliberately using my presence as a prop for her own vanity. "It truly takes a village to raise a family," my mother said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "We always believed in teaching our daughters the value of knowing their place in the world." Chloe took to the pressures of the corporate and medical elite effortlessly. She has that natural Jefferson drive. But Zoya, well, she prefers a much simpler existence. We let her stay in the guest house so she can find her footing. Some children simply lack the ambition to thrive under pressure. The senator's wife offered a polite, pitying smile, glancing at my plain black uniform, before quickly looking away. "That is so generous of you, Patricia," the woman murmured. "It is a blessing to have a family that can support those who fall behind." I did not flinch. I did not spill a single drop of water. I poured the ice water into the goblet next to my mother with perfectly steady hands. Her words were designed to humiliate me, to strip away my dignity in front of the most powerful people in the city. But the insult meant absolutely nothing to me now. I knew the truth. Patricia was sitting in a chair she did not own, drinking wine she could not afford, pretending to be a philanthropist while facing imminent federal indictment. Her passive-aggressive cruelty was the last desperate gasp of a dying empire. Chloe leaned across the table, her diamond earrings catching the light from the chandelier. She placed a possessive hand on Trent's shoulder, making sure the investors noticed her devotion. "It is exactly like Trent always says," Chloe chimed in, her voice carrying loudly over the ambient noise of the room. "You simply cannot teach genius. Trent is literally changing the future of medical diagnostics, working around the clock to revolutionize healthcare. Meanwhile, my sister is just trying to figure out which side of the plate the salad fork goes on. I suppose we all have our different talents." Trent let out a loud, obnoxious laugh, shaking his head with mock humility. "Now, Chloe, do not be too hard on your sister," he said, looking at me with a sickening smirk. "Someone has to keep our glasses full while we change the world. We appreciate the hustle, Zoya. We really do." Polite, condescending laughter rippled across the dining table. I stood frozen in place, my face a mask of complete emotional detachment. I looked at Trent, the mediocre man who could not even read the biochemical data he was claiming to have invented. I looked at Chloe, the sister who poured bleach on my grandmother's legacy just to make herself feel superior. I looked at my parents, who smiled proudly at the public humiliation of their eldest daughter. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the paper taped to my ribs. I bowed my head slightly, stepping away from the table. While the guests returned to their expensive meals and loud conversations, I began to circle the perimeter of the dining room. The room had 3 separate exits: the massive double doors leading to the main foyer, the service doors leading back to the kitchen, and a set of heavy French doors opening out onto the side patio. I walked over to the patio doors first, pretending to adjust the heavy velvet drapes that framed the glass. Under the cover of the thick fabric, I reached down and quietly slid the heavy brass deadbolt all the way into the locked position. A soft, solid click signaled that the first escape route was completely sealed. Nobody noticed. My father was too busy pouring a rare vintage of red wine for Mr. Sterling, continuing his relentless campaign of flattery and status projection. I picked up an empty silver tray from a side table and moved silently along the expensive wallpaper towards the service doors. I stood with my back to the wall, waiting for the exact moment the room erupted in laughter over another one of Trent's terrible, arrogant jokes. Under the cover of their booming voices, I casually kicked my sensible black shoe against the base of the service doors, engaging the floor lock. 2 doors sealed, 1 remaining. The tension in my chest was electric. My heart beat a slow, powerful rhythm that echoed the absolute certainty of what was about to happen. I was no longer the invisible, broken girl they had discarded 5 years ago. I was the architect of their destruction, and I had just trapped the rats inside the maze. I moved back toward the table, keeping my eyes fixed on Mr. Sterling. The billionaire had barely spoken a word since I entered the room. He was watching Trent with a highly critical, analytical gaze. When I stepped forward to refill his water glass, Mr. Sterling looked up at me. His eyes darted briefly to the ruined, bleach-stained hem of my grandmother's blazer that I wore deliberately beneath my uniform apron. He saw the steady, unwavering calm in my hands. He saw the cold, sharp intelligence in my posture that contradicted the servant role I was playing. He did not say anything, but I saw a flicker of genuine curiosity cross his weathered face. He knew something was entirely out of place in this house. Patricia snapped her fingers at me from across the table, breaking the moment. Zoya, stop hovering over the guests and clear the salad plates, she ordered sharply. We do not want to keep Mr. Sterling waiting for the main course. Time is money, something you would understand if you ever held a real job. Go to the kitchen and tell the caterers to hurry up. I nodded politely, picking up 2 empty porcelain plates. I did not walk toward the kitchen. I walked backward, moving slowly toward the final exit, the grand double doors leading out to the main foyer. As I reached the threshold, the room suddenly hushed. Trent stood up from his chair. He smoothed the lapels of his custom-tailored suit, shooting a confident, arrogant look at Chloe, before turning his attention entirely to the billionaire investor seated beside him. He picked up his crystal champagne flute and a heavy silver spoon. He tapped the spoon against the crystal. The sharp ringing sound cut through the ambient noise, demanding the absolute attention of every single person in the room. The conversations died instantly. All eyes turned to the head of the table. Thank you all for being here tonight. Trent began, his voice projecting with the practiced hollow charisma of a salesman who believed his own lies. Tonight is not just about celebrating the Jefferson family legacy. Tonight is about introducing you to the absolute pinnacle of medical innovation. We are here to talk about the future of Novatech and the diagnostic algorithm that is going to change the world forever. Trent clicked a sleek wireless remote in his hand. The heavy velvet curtains at the far end of the dining room automatically drew shut, and a high-definition projection screen descended silently from the ceiling. He paced the length of the mahogany table, exuding the unearned, reckless confidence of a man who had been told his entire life that he was brilliant simply for existing. He unbuttoned his linen suit jacket, striking a casual, visionary pose that he had absolutely stolen from a magazine cover. Welcome to the future of healthcare, Trent announced, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. What you are about to see is not just a software update, it is a complete paradigm shift. Novatech has developed a proprietary diagnostic algorithm that identifies microscopic autoimmune irregularities years before a patient ever shows physical symptoms. He clicked the remote again. A complex flowchart illuminated the screen, filled with dense biochemical equations and predictive modeling graphs. I stood near the heavy double doors of the main foyer, my hand resting casually behind my back. My fingers found the cold brass of the deadbolt. I slid it firmly into the locked position. The heavy mechanism engaged with a quiet, solid click that was entirely drowned out by Trent's voice to the room. 3 doors, 3 locks. The dining room was now a sealed vault. I turned my attention back to the screen, and a wave of absolute revulsion washed over me. I recognized that flowchart. It was not a modernized corporate presentation. It was an exact literal scan of page 4 from my grandmother's original patent application filed 12 years ago. Trent had not even bothered to reformat her work. He had simply slapped his ridiculous Novatech logo over Dr. Josephine Jefferson's name. Our system utilizes advanced. Trent paused, squinting slightly at the screen as he struggled to read the medical terminology he had stolen. Our system utilizes advanced cytokine biomarkers to map the immune response. By tracking these specific protein degradation rates, we can achieve a 99% accuracy rate in predicting autoimmune pathogenesis. He mispronounced cytokine. He butchered pathogenesis. He spoke the words with the clumsy, hesitant cadence of a middle school student reading a foreign language from a chalkboard. He did not know what those proteins did. He did not understand the cellular degradation rates he was pointing at. He was wearing my grandmother's genius like a stolen suit that did not fit his shoulders. I looked around the table. The politicians and hospital administrators were nodding thoughtfully, completely blinded by the aesthetic of his presentation. They saw a confident, wealthy white man pitching a tech startup in a multi-million-dollar Buckhead mansion. To them, he looked exactly like the kind of person who revolutionized industries. They did not question his fumbling of the terminology. They gave him the benefit of the doubt, a privilege my grandmother had to fight tooth and nail for every single day of her professional life. But Mr. Sterling was not a politician. The billionaire venture capitalist leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished mahogany table. He steepled his fingers, his sharp, predatory eyes darting from the complex algorithms on the screen to the bead of sweat suddenly forming on Trent's forehead. Fascinating concept. Trent. Mr. Sterling said, his voice a low, gravelly baritone that instantly commanded the room. But let us talk about the data integration. Your projected false negative reduction relies heavily on mapping T-cell memory against pre-existing patient registries. How exactly does your proprietary code bypass the standard HIPAA encryption firewalls without triggering a localized server crash during the data pull? The dining room went completely still. It was a highly specific, fundamentally necessary technical question. It was the exact kind of question a man writing a $20 million check expects you to answer in your sleep. Trent froze. The confident, visionary smile slid off his face, replaced by the distinct look of a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming semi-truck. He looked at the screen, then at his notes, his jaw working as he tried to piece together corporate buzzwords to cover his absolute ignorance. "Well, Mr. Sterling," Trent stammered, adjusting his collar as a fresh wave of panic hit him. That is the beauty of our system. We are synergizing the data. We utilize a cloud-based blockchain approach that essentially disrupts the traditional firewall paradigm. It is highly technical, but our back-end developers ensure the integration is completely seamless. It was pure, unadulterated garbage. A string of meaningless Silicon Valley catchphrases strung together to hide the fact that he was staring at a blank wall. Mr. Sterling did not nod. He did not smile. He simply stared at Trent, his expression hardening into cold, unimpressed skepticism. The silence in the room stretched out thick and incredibly uncomfortable. Desmond shifted in his chair at the head of the table, coughing loudly into his fist to break the tension. My father had absolutely no idea what blockchain or T-cell memory meant, but he knew exactly what a failing sales pitch looked like. Trent realized he was losing the room. He needed a distraction. He needed to pivot the energy of the dinner back to his comfort zone, back to an arena where he held absolute dominance. He needed someone to step on so he could elevate himself. His desperate, searching eyes swept across the dining room and locked directly onto me. I was standing near the wall in my plain black uniform dress, holding a heavy-cut crystal carafe of expensive red wine. I was the perfect target. The invisible, subservient family failure. Trent let out a loud, forced chuckle, clapping his hands together as he stepped away from the projection screen. "But enough about the dense coding architecture," Trent announced, forcing a bright, jovial tone back into his voice. "Building a company like Novatech is about more than just the data. It takes a specific kind of DNA. It takes a relentless, uncompromising drive to succeed that frankly not everyone possesses." He walked around the table, stopping directly behind Chloe's chair. He placed a hand on his wife's shoulder, projecting the image of a powerful, unified couple. Then he raised his other hand and pointed his index finger straight at me. "Take my sister-in-law, Zoya, over there," Trent said, his voice booming across the silent room. "It is a real shame she does not share our entrepreneurial spirit. We offered to bring her into the fold to let her learn the family business. But she is 32 years old and still trying to figure out how to pass basic biology." He let out another loud, obnoxious laugh, shaking his head with exaggerated pity. He looked around the table, making sure every wealthy investor and politician was looking at me standing against the wall in my servant uniform. "But hey," Trent continued, shrugging his shoulders with a mockingly helpless expression, "somebody has to pour the wine, right?" The dining room erupted. It was not a roar of laughter. It was worse. It was the polite, breathy, synchronized chuckling of wealthy elites who found the degradation of a black woman serving them food to be an incredibly amusing dinner theater. The sound scraped against my ears like rough sandpaper. I looked at my mother. Patricia was beaming. She took a delicate sip of her Chardonnay, her eyes sparkling with malicious joy. She was visibly thrilled that Trent had put me in my place so publicly. She loved that the investors saw her as the gracious matriarch dealing with a hopelessly inadequate child. I looked at Chloe. My sister rested her chin on her hands, radiating pure toxic satisfaction. She smirked at me, her eyes dropping to the bleach-stained hem of my grandmother's blazer, peeking out from beneath my black apron. She thought she had won. She thought the hierarchy of this house was permanently set in stone, with her on a golden throne and me scrubbing the floors beneath it. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not look down at my sensible black shoes. I felt the stiff, rigid edges of the notarized legal documents pressing sharply against my ribs. I felt the federal injunctions, the forged death certificate, the property deeds. I was standing in a room full of arrogant, laughing vultures, wearing a literal armor of undeniable justice. I tightened my grip on the neck of the heavy crystal carafe. The red wine sloshed dark and rich against the faceted glass. I stepped away from the wall. I walked slowly and deliberately across the expensive Persian rug. I did not rush. I took my time, my posture perfectly straight, my chin held high. I walked right up to the gap between Trent and Mr. Sterling. Trent was still smiling, assuming I was approaching the table to dutifully refill his glass, assuming I was going to swallow the humiliation and serve him exactly as I was trained to do. I stood over the mahogany table. I looked Trent dead in the eye. The arrogant smirk on his face faltered for a fraction of a second when he saw the absolute terrifying void in my expression. I did not pour the wine. I lifted the heavy crystal carafe an inch above the polished wood. With a sudden, forceful, and deliberate motion, I brought the solid glass base down directly onto the center of the mahogany table. Thud! The sound cracked through the cavernous dining room like a gunshot. The heavy vibration rattled the silverware and sent a tremor through the crystal water goblets. The laughter died instantly. The polite chuckling was severed mid-breath. The silence that rushed into the room was absolute, suffocating, and incredibly dangerous. Every single eye at the table snapped up to look at me. The dark red wine rippled violently inside the crystal carafe. The thud echoed off the vaulted ceiling, and then the silence was absolute. Everyone at the long mahogany table froze. The wealthy politicians stopped chewing. The hospital administrators lowered their forks. My mother Patricia dropped her linen napkin onto her lap, her mouth falling open in shock. I did not look at my mother. I did not look at my sister. I did not even look at Trent, who was standing by the projection screen, with a foolish, confused smile still plastered on his face. I turned my head and looked directly into the sharp, assessing eyes of Mr. Sterling. The billionaire investor did not flinch or look away from me. He leaned forward slightly, his predatory instincts sensing blood in the water. He recognized that the woman standing before him was not a servant who had lost her mind. He recognized a profound and dangerous shift in power. "It is funny you mention the entrepreneurial spirit, Trent," I said. My voice was completely calm, carrying effortlessly across the expanse of the long dining table. Because according to the United States Patent Office, the algorithm you are pitching to Mr. Sterling was not coded by you. Trent blinked rapidly. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden ugly flush of red that crept up his neck. He forced a harsh, awkward laugh, looking around at the guests as if expecting them to join in on the joke. "Zoya, shut your mouth right now!" Trent snapped, his voice tight with rising panic. He turned to the investors with a dismissive wave of his hand. "I am so sorry, everyone. My sister-in-law has a habit of drinking on the job. She is clearly intoxicated or having another one of her episodes." I ignored his pathetic attempt to discredit me. I kept my eyes locked entirely on the billionaire venture capitalist. Mr. Sterling ignored Trent as well. He was watching my face, waiting for the rest of my statement. "That code was patented 12 years ago." I continued articulating every single syllable with lethal precision. "It was authored, tested, and legally registered by Dr. Josephine Jefferson." The name hit the dining room table like a physical explosive. The older hospital administrators in the room gasped aloud. They knew exactly who my grandmother was. They knew her legacy. They knew her brilliance. They also knew that the complex biochemical diagnostic markers Trent had just fumbled through perfectly matched the pioneering research of the late Dr. Jefferson. I watched the realization dawn on their faces as they connected the stolen data on the projection screen to the ghost of the woman who actually created it. My father erupted. Desmond slammed his heavy fist down onto the polished wood table so hard the crystal wine glasses violently shook. His face turned a deep mottled purple. The veins in his neck strained against his expensive silk tie. The carefully constructed mask of the refined elite Atlanta patriarch shattered, completely revealing the desperate cornered thief underneath. "Zoya," Desmond roared. His booming voice shattered the remaining silence in the room. "Go to the kitchen, right now. You are having a psychiatric breakdown in front of our guests." My father stood up from his chair at the head of the table. He looked frantically at Mr. Sterling, attempting to slap on a mask of deep paternal distress. He was weaponizing the very real stigma of mental health to silence me, a tactic he had used to isolate and control me for the last decade. "I apologize profoundly, Mr. Sterling," my father said, his voice trembling with manufactured grief. "My eldest daughter has struggled with severe mental illness for years. She suffers from terrible delusions and paranoia. We try to keep her involved in the household to give her a sense of purpose, but clearly she has gone off her medication. I will have the staff remove her immediately so we can get her the medical help she desperately needs." "I am calling security," Chloe shrieked. My sister jumped up from her chair. Her designer evening gown caught the edge of her water goblet, knocking it over and spilling ice across the pristine white tablecloth. Her perfectly contoured face was twisted with absolute rage. The facade of the gracious, supportive wife had vanished. "You jealous, psychotic failure," Chloe screamed at me across the table. "How dare you try to ruin Trent's night? You cannot stand the fact that he is a genius and you are nothing. I am having you thrown off the property. You will never step foot in this house again." Chloe grabbed her smartphone from the table. Her manicured fingers were shaking with fury as she began frantically dialing the estate security team. Patricia was clutching her pearl necklace, whispering frantic, embarrassed apologies to the senator's wife seated next to her. My mother was completely mortified by the public spectacle, desperately trying to salvage her social standing while her empire began to crack. I did not retreat. I did not cower. I did not let their screaming or their threats push me back into the shadows. I turned my back on the dining table and walked with slow, deliberate steps toward the massive double doors leading to the main foyer. "Grab her," Trent yelled, pointing at me. He barked the order at one of the hired catering waiters who was standing frozen near the wall. "Get her out of here before she completely ruins the presentation. Do not just stand there, grab her." Nobody moved to touch me. The catering staff wanted no part of this family meltdown. I reached the grand double doors undisturbed. I placed my hands on the heavy brass handles and pulled them firmly shut. The sound of the thick wood sealing perfectly into place echoed through the tense room. Then I reached up and loudly slid the heavy brass deadbolt all the way across. The metallic lock engaged with a definitive, inescapable click. I had already locked the patio doors. I had already jammed the service entrance. The dining room was now a sealed vault. I turned back to face the room. I reached behind my back and untied the strings of the plain black uniform apron my mother had forced me to wear. I let the cheap fabric drop to the hardwood floor. The apron fell away, fully exposing the bottom half of my grandmother's navy wool blazer. The jacket was still mottled and scarred with the violent yellow bleach stains Chloe had inflicted upon it just days ago. The ruined fabric stood out like a battle scar against the luxury of the room. I reached into the bodice of my dress. I pulled out the thick waterproof plastic sleeve I had taped tightly against my ribs. I ripped the plastic open and pulled out a massive stack of thick legal envelopes. The heavy notarized documents landed in my hands. I held the federal injunctions, the forged death certificate, and the property deeds like a loaded weapon. "Nobody is leaving," I announced. My voice dropped into a dark, commanding register that froze every single person in their tracks. The screaming stopped. Chloe lowered her phone. Desmond stared at the documents in my hands, the blood completely draining from his face as he realized exactly what I was holding. "Mr. Sterling," I said, looking right at the billionaire who was now watching me with intense, calculating fascination. "You might want to put your checkbook away, because you are about to buy stolen property from a family of felons." The silence in the dining room lasted exactly 3 seconds before my mother shattered it. Patricia let out a shrill, piercing shriek that echoed off the crystal chandelier. She slammed her hands flat against the mahogany table, her designer rings clattering violently against the polished wood. "How dare you!" Patricia screamed, her voice losing every ounce of its refined southern polish. "You ungrateful, malicious girl. You unlock those doors right this instant and get out of my house before I have you arrested for trespassing." I did not move. I held the stack of thick legal envelopes against my chest, feeling the heavy parchment paper grounding me. Trent decided to play the protector. His face flushed a dark, angry red, contrasting sharply with his tailored linen suit. He pushed his chair back so violently it tipped over and crashed onto the expensive Persian rug. "You are completely out of your mind, Zoya," Trent snarled. He marched around the table, his fists clenched at his sides. He thought he could intimidate me. He thought because he was a tall, privileged white man who had spent his entire life getting exactly what he wanted, he could simply physically overpower a black woman standing in his way. He closed the distance between us, raising his arm to grab my shoulder and force me toward the exit. I never even made contact before Trent could lay a single finger on me. Two massive men in dark suits stepped out from the shadows near the corner of the room. Mr. Sterling's private security detail moved with terrifying silent efficiency. One guard stepped smoothly between me and Trent, planting a massive hand squarely in the center of Trent's chest. The impact stopped Trent dead in his tracks, knocking the wind out of him. "Take a seat, sir," the security guard said. His voice was completely flat, but it carried an unmistakable threat of professional violence. Trent stumbled backward, his bravado instantly evaporating. He looked over at the billionaire venture capitalist, expecting backup. "Mr. Sterling, this is a private family matter. Tell your men to back off." Mr. Sterling did not call off his guards. The older billionaire sat perfectly still, swirling the red wine in his goblet. His predatory eyes shifted from Trent's sweating face to the stack of legal documents in my hands. Mr. Sterling was a man who managed billions of dollars globally. He knew a liability when he saw one, and right now Trent was looking like a massive, catastrophic liability. "I prefer my men exactly where they are," Mr. Sterling said smoothly. "In my experience, when someone locks the doors and pulls out legal documents during a pitch, it is usually in my best financial interest to listen to what they have to say. Go ahead, young lady, you have the floor." I offered Mr. Sterling a brief, respectful nod. Then I turned my attention entirely back to Trent. I walked past the security guard, closing the distance until I was standing directly across the table from my brother-in-law. I pulled the first thick, notarized document from the top of my stack. I did not hand it to him politely. I tossed it across the table. It landed with a wet, heavy smack directly on top of his expensive medium-rare filet mignon. The thick parchment soaked up the dark peppercorn sauce, but the bold federal seal printed at the top remained perfectly legible. "That is a federal injunction," I announced, making sure my voice carried to every single politician and hospital administrator trapped in the room. "Signed and executed by a federal judge 3 hours ago. Your company Novatech is officially frozen by the federal court. You cannot move a single asset. You cannot sign a single contract. You cannot accept a single dime of venture capital funding." Trent stared at the gravy-soaked document, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "You cannot do this. You have no legal standing. This is my company. I built this diagnostic code from scratch. You do not even know how to write a basic line of Python code." "Trent?" I fired back, my voice dripping with absolute contempt. "You could not even pronounce the cellular degradation rates on your own presentation slides. You did not build anything. You stole it." I gestured toward the massive projection screen that was still displaying my grandmother's brilliant, complex biochemical flowchart. "That intellectual property does not belong to Novatech." I continued, speaking slowly, so every guest in the room could absorb the magnitude of the fraud. "It belongs to the Josephine Jefferson Trust. It is a legally protected closed trust, established 12 years ago by one of the most brilliant surgical minds in this state. And according to the terms of that trust, the patents, the capital, and all corresponding intellectual property rights belong exclusively to the trust." Chloe jumped up from her seat, her diamond earrings shaking as she pointed a manicured finger at me. "You are lying. You have always been a jealous, pathetic liar. Grandma left everything to the family. Dad controls the estate. Dad controls a proxy account." I corrected her, not breaking my gaze from Trent. "But the foundational assets that you have been illegally leveraging to fund your luxury cars and your $1 million wedding belong to one person, me, a trust that I am the sole beneficiary of." The collective gasp from the dining table was incredibly satisfying. The elite guests began murmuring to each other, actively connecting the dots. They looked at the bleach-stained hem of my grandmother's blazer, peeking out from my apron, then up at the projection screen, and finally back to Trent, who was physically trembling. The political allies my father had cultivated for years were physically leaning away from the table, realizing they were sitting in a blast radius. "You cannot prove any of this," Trent stammered, looking desperately at Mr. Sterling. She is a lab technician. She works night shifts at a public hospital. She does not have the legal authority to freeze a corporate entity. I do when the corporate entity was built using embezzled funds and stolen medical patents, I said. My legal counsel filed the injunction using the original patent registration numbers. The federal court recognized the theft immediately. Your accounts are locked, Trent. Your startup is dead. Your $20 million buyout is a complete fantasy. The reality of the situation crashed down on the room. If what I was saying was true, every single person who had invested in Trent's company was going to lose their money. And my parents, the untouchable pillars of Atlanta society, were facing massive federal exposure. My father finally realized that his entire empire was moments away from total annihilation. Desmond grabbed the edges of the mahogany table and hauled himself to his feet. His face was covered in a slick sheen of nervous sweat. He forced a wide, tight smile that looked more like a grimace, trying to project the calm, commanding patriarch image he had relied on for decades. "Mr. Sterling, everyone, please," Desmond laughed. It was a hollow, frantic sound that echoed painfully in the tense room. "Please excuse my daughter. I told you earlier she has severe psychiatric issues. She does not know what she is talking about. This is a complete delusion brought on by her untreated condition." He pulled a pristine white handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed aggressively at his forehead. He looked at the investors, his eyes wide with desperate, unhinged panic. He was literally sweating through the collar of his expensive dress shirt. "She has no access to any trust," Desmond insisted, his voice rising in pitch as he stumbled over his own massive, devastating lie. He waved his hand dismissively at the federal injunction sitting on Trent's dinner plate. "That trust was liquidated 5 years ago when she passed. I mean, when it expired." I watched the heavy beads of sweat gather on my father's forehead. Desmond Jefferson, the untouchable titan of Atlanta real estate, was drowning in his own lies right in front of the most powerful people in the city. He had just slipped up his subconscious panic, betraying the darkest secret this family held. He had almost said passed before quickly correcting himself to expired. I let my lips curve into a slow, terrifying smile. "You mean the trust you drained by legally declaring me dead 5 years ago?" I asked. I reached into the plastic sleeve hidden against my ribs and pulled out the crisp, high-definition copy of the State of Georgia Certificate of Death. I tossed it across the mahogany table. The heavy paper sailed through the air and landed perfectly between the towering white orchid centerpiece and my father's untouched wine glass. "I had a very interesting chat with Dean Harrison at the Medical Institute yesterday morning," I said, making sure my voice reached every corner of the silent room. "He sends his regards, Dad." The dining room erupted into a symphony of pure, unadulterated horror. Several of the wealthy hospital administrators actually gasped aloud, the sound tearing through the suffocating tension. The elite politicians and local judges seated around the table physically recoiled, pressing their backs hard against their upholstered chairs, as if my parents had suddenly become contagious. They were looking at the death certificate, then looking up at me, a living, breathing woman standing in a plain black uniform dress. The reality of the crime crashed down on them. Desmond and Patricia Jefferson had not just engaged in standard corporate maneuvering. They had committed a profound sociopathic act of federal fraud, and they had dragged every single guest in this room into the blast radius. Mr. Sterling did not gasp. The billionaire investor did not shrink back into his chair. He stood up. The movement was slow and deliberate, carrying the immense, crushing weight of a man who had just realized he was seconds away from committing his venture capital firm to a massive criminal conspiracy. His face hardened into absolute granite. The calculating, predatory businessman vanished, replaced by a ruthless titan who was about to scorch the earth. Mr. Sterling reached across the table and picked up the death certificate. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes scanning the harsh black type on the official watermarked paper. He read my name. He read the date of my supposed fatal car accident. He read the forged signatures of my mother and father at the bottom of the page. I did not give my father a chance to speak. I stepped closer to the table and slid the corresponding stack of wire transfer records directly toward Mr. Sterling. Cross-reference the date of that death certificate with the first major withdrawal from the Josephine Jefferson Trust I instructed, speaking to the billionaire as a completely equal business partner. You will see that exactly 48 hours after they legally slaughtered me in a rural county court, my father transferred $3 million into a shell company. He then used that stolen capital to collateralize the loan that built Novatech. Your entire $20 million buyout is structured on blood money and ghost accounts. Mr. Sterling picked up the financial ledgers. He aligned them side by side with the death certificate. He traced the routing numbers with his index finger, his sharp eyes moving rapidly across the columns of data. The math was undeniable. The timeline was perfectly brutally clear. Desmond lunged forward. Panic completely overtook his remaining sense of self-preservation. He reached across the table, his manicured hands clawing desperately at the documents Mr. Sterling was holding. "Give me those," Desmond roared, his voice cracking with hysteria. "These are fabricated. She hacked my private server and manufactured these documents because she is a jealous, unstable failure. She has been trying to destroy this family for years." He never reached the papers. The private security guard who had neutralized Trent earlier moved with lightning speed, clamping an iron grip onto my father's wrist and forcing his arm back down to the table. The guard pushed Desmond hard into his chair, standing over him with a silent, imposing threat. "Do not reach across this table again, Desmond." Mr. Sterling warned, his voice, a low, dangerous rumble that sent a shiver through the room. Patricia scrambled to her feet, her hands shaking so violently, her diamond bracelets rattled together. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her face twisted into a mask of desperate, cornered rage. "Do not listen to her," my mother shrieked, her eyes darting frantically between the guests. "She is a liar. She stole our computer passwords. She manipulated digital files to make us look like criminals. We never filed that certificate. We never touched her grandmother's money. We have supported her entirely out of the goodness of our hearts." I turned my absolute focus onto my mother. The sheer audacity she possessed to stand in a stolen mansion and claim innocence was staggering. "Are you entirely sure about that, Mom?" I asked, taking a step toward her. "Because those wire transfers Mr. Sterling is holding right now detail every single purchase you made with my dead name. They outline the exact routing numbers used to pay for the designer evening gown Chloe is currently wearing. They show the $50,000 initiation fee you paid to your elite country club just last month. They even show the direct deposits made to the catering company that cooked the filet mignon sitting on your plate tonight. You are literally eating my inheritance." Chloe let out a choked, sobbing noise. She looked down at her custom crimson dress as if it were suddenly covered in blood. The golden child facade was melting right off her face. She looked at Trent silently, begging her husband to fix the situation, to use his arrogant tech bro magic to make the nightmare go away. But Trent was not looking at his wife. He was looking at the investors around the table. The prominent politicians were quietly sliding their chairs back, reaching for their phones to frantically text their crisis management teams. The hospital administrators who had praised my father just an hour ago were refusing to make eye contact with him. Everyone in the room recognized that the Jefferson family brand was officially dead. The social and legal fallout of this dinner was going to dominate the Atlanta news cycle for the next decade, and no one wanted their face associated with a family of brazen felons. Mr. Sterling tossed the wire transfers back onto the mahogany table. He looked at my father with a level of disgust so profound it stripped away every ounce of Desmond's remaining dignity. "You sat in my office last week and shook my hand," Mr. Sterling said, his tone icy and unforgiving. "You looked me in the eye and guaranteed the chain of title on this algorithm was completely clean. You tried to leverage my firm into a federal money laundering scheme. I will make absolutely certain that you never do business in this state or any other state ever again." Mr. Sterling turned to his security detail, signaling that it was time to go. He reached down to grab his leather briefcase. The reality of the $20 million deal evaporating right in front of him finally snapped Trent out of his frozen shock. The arrogant, entitled veneer shattered, revealing a desperate, cowardly man willing to do absolutely anything to save his own skin. He realized that aligning himself with the Jefferson family was no longer his golden ticket to wealth. It was a one-way ticket to federal prison. Trent scrambled forward, practically shoving his own wife out of the way to get closer to the billionaire investor. The panic in his eyes was absolute. He threw his hands up in a placating gesture, sweating through his expensive linen suit. "Wait, Mr. Sterling, please," Trent shouted, his voice cracking with pure desperation. "This is a misunderstanding. I did not know about the forged death certificate. I swear to God I had no idea what her parents did to the trust fund. They handled all the initial seed financing. I am just the developer." Chloe gasped, staring at her husband in absolute betrayal as he publicly threw her parents to the wolves. "We can still do this deal," Trent pleaded, stepping closer to Mr. Sterling and completely ignoring the chaos exploding around him. "We can separate my startup from their financial crimes. We still own the physical assets of the company. We still have the buyout equity. We can restructure the board tomorrow morning and push them out completely. Just sign the acquisition papers and we can fix this." "You own nothing, Trent," I said. My voice sliced through his pathetic, desperate pleading and instantly commanded the room. I reached into the waterproof plastic sleeve hidden beneath my uniform dress one last time and pulled out the final heaviest stack of papers. I did not toss these documents casually. I walked directly up to the center of the mahogany table and dropped them with a loud, resounding thud that shook the crystal glasses and silenced his rambling excuses. "Because Valerie and I did not just freeze your assets, we bought out your debt." Trent froze. His hands remained suspended in the air where he had been frantically gesturing toward Mr. Sterling. The color that had rushed to his face during his panicked negotiation drained away completely. He looked like a hollow, terrified shell. He stared at the thick stack of legal contracts on the table, but he was too paralyzed to even reach for them. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The arrogant tech executive who had spent the last year pretending to be a visionary was gone. I turned my gaze away from him and looked directly at my parents. Desmond was gripping the edge of the mahogany table, so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He was breathing heavily through his nose like a cornered animal trapped in a snare of his own making. Patricia was staring at the documents with her eyes wide and her jaw slack. The smug, arrogant mask she had worn all evening had completely evaporated. "The $5 million commercial loan you took out against this estate to fund Trent's fake company," I asked, making sure every single syllable landed like a physical blow. "It defaulted. You thought you were so brilliant, Dad. You thought you could outsmart the financial system by collateralizing our family home on the assumption that Trent would secure a massive venture capital buyout within 6 months. You truly believed you could sell my grandmother's stolen diagnostic algorithm before the bank ever came knocking on your door." Desmond opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just stared at me as the absolute terror began to cloud his vision. He was a man who cared about nothing but his reputation and control, and he was losing both in spectacular fashion. "But Trent is a fraud," I continued, my voice cold and entirely merciless. "And frauds bleed cash. He burned through that seed money in less than 6 months buying luxury cars and hosting extravagant networking parties while producing absolutely zero workable code. When the cash dried up, you missed your last 3 loan payments. You knew the bank was preparing to foreclose on this property. You knew this elaborate dinner was your absolute last chance to secure funding before the eviction notices arrived. But what you did not know is that banks despise toxic assets. When you defaulted, they quietly offloaded that bad debt to a private equity collection firm for pennies on the dollar. The elite guests sitting around the dining room table were perfectly still. They were powerful politicians and administrators who understood the ruthless mechanics of wealth and real estate. They knew exactly where this story was going before I even finished the explanation. I watched them actively distance themselves from my family. They watched my father shrink into his chair, stripped of all his power and dignity. "I purchased that debt yesterday morning," I announced. "I used my grandmother's actual legitimate trust fund, the one you failed to completely drain before the escrow locked you out. Which means I own Novatech's debt. I own every single physical asset your company supposedly possesses. And more importantly, I own the deed to this house." The shockwave that hit the dining room was visceral. The politicians and hospital administrators stared at my parents with a mixture of revulsion and awe. Desmond Jefferson, the man who had just stood at the head of the table boasting about his family legacy and his uncompromising brilliance, was officially a trespasser in his own home. He did not own the expensive Persian rugs beneath his feet. He did not own the crystal chandelier hanging above his head. I did not own the mahogany table where he had just humiliated his own daughter. He was a guest in my house, and his invitation had just expired. Patricia let out a sharp, choked gasp. Her hands flew to her chest, and her fingers clutched desperately at her expensive pearl necklace. Her eyes rolled back slightly, and she collapsed heavily into her upholstered dining chair. Her pristine silk blouse heaved rapidly as she struggled to draw breath. She was having a severe panic attack right in front of the senator's wife she had been trying to impress all evening. The illusion of her high society supremacy was dead. It was instantly replaced by the terrifying reality of impending homelessness and federal indictment. She looked at the wealthy friends she had invited to witness her triumph, and she saw them actively leaning away from her in disgust. They looked at her as if she were a criminal, which she absolutely was. "This is a lie," Desmond whispered. His voice was completely broken and frail, a stark contrast to the booming authority he had projected an hour ago. "You cannot do this. We have homestead protections. We have legal rights. We have equity in this property. You cannot just take our home. You waived those rights the moment you committed federal wire fraud to secure the initial collateral," I informed him with absolute certainty. "My attorneys have already filed the corporate takeover documents and the eviction notices with the county clerk." "You have no legal standing, Dad. You gambled your entire empire on a mediocre man who could not even read the medical data you stole for him. You handed him the keys to your kingdom, and he drove it straight into a brick wall." Chloe had been standing frozen near her spilled water goblet, watching her husband humiliate himself and her parents lose everything in the span of 3 minutes. The reality of her situation was finally breaching the thick walls of her delusion. She was not a wealthy socialite married to a tech genius. She was the accomplice to a massive criminal fraud married to a coward who had just tried to sell her out to save his own skin. She looked down at her custom crimson designer dress and realized she could not afford a single thread of it. The golden child facade had melted entirely, leaving behind a terrified, desperate woman who had never worked a single day in her life. She turned to Trent and her hands began shaking violently. The realization that he had just attempted to cut a deal with Mr. Sterling by throwing her parents under the bus was fully sinking in. Trent had proven he possessed zero loyalty to her or her family. He only cared about his own survival, and he was failing miserably at that. "Tell them she is lying, Trent," Chloe shrieked. Her voice was shrill and panicked, echoing desperately across the silent dining room. She grabbed his arm and dug her manicured nails into his expensive linen jacket, pulling at the fabric. "Tell them we still have the buyout money. Tell them you can fix this." Trent stared at the woman he had married for money that no longer existed. His eyes darted from Chloe's mascara-stained face to the end of the table where Mr. Sterling was snapping the golden clasps of his leather briefcase shut. The calculating tech visionary act completely evaporated. The charming smile he used to charm my parents into funding his lavish lifestyle was gone. What remained was a cornered coward realizing the walls were closing in. "Shut up, Chloe," Trent snarled, his voice dripping with absolute venom. He shoved her manicured hands off his expensive linen jacket with such force that she stumbled backward into her chair. "Do not touch me. This is your family's mess. I am not going down for your father's fraudulent financial schemes." Chloe gasped, clutching her chest as if he had physically struck her. Trent did not give her a second glance. He turned his back on his sobbing wife and shoved his way past the bewildered guests. He knocked a prominent local judge hard in the shoulder, making a desperate beeline for the grand mahogany double doors leading to the foyer. He grabbed the brass handles and rattled them violently, forgetting in his blind panic that I had thrown the deadbolt securely into place just 10 minutes earlier. "Unlock this door right now," Trent demanded, shouting over his shoulder at me. He was practically foaming at the mouth, sweating profusely as he yanked on the heavy brass. I did not move a single muscle. I stood exactly where I was, letting the silence of the room amplify his pathetic desperation. Mr. Sterling did not even look up from his briefcase. He simply raised 2 fingers into the air. The 2 massive private security guards who had been standing like statues near the perimeter of the room moved with terrifying synchronization. They crossed the Persian rug in 3 large strides and stepped directly in front of the mahogany doors, physically wedging Trent against the wood. One of the guards placed a hand the size of a dinner plate firmly in the center of Trent's chest. pressing him flat against the doorframe. "You are not going anywhere, son," Mr. Sterling said. His voice was a low, gravelly rumble that commanded the absolute submission of every single person in the room. "You pitched me a medical algorithm built on federal wire fraud and stolen intellectual property. That alone is enough to have you blacklisted from every venture capital firm on the East Coast. But my forensic accountants will be looking into the $2 million seed money you already embezzled from my firm last quarter under the guise of offshore research and development." Trent went completely pale, the last remaining ounce of blood drained from his face as he stared at the billionaire. "That was authorized corporate spending," Trent stammered, his voice pitching up into a terrified whine. "I can show you the expense reports. I can prove it was allocated for server architecture." "You bought a yacht in the Bahamas, Trent," Mr. Sterling replied, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. "You named it Nova and registered it under a blind holding company. Did you honestly think my analysts would not find that paper trail the second we initiated the due diligence phase of this buyout? My legal team is currently drafting the embezzlement charges. You will stay exactly where you are until the federal authorities arrive to take my statement." The sound of a shattered wine glass drew everyone's attention back to the dining table. Chloe was standing over her broken crystal goblet. The pristine white tablecloth was soaking up a spreading pool of red wine, looking like an open wound. She stared at Trent, pinned against the doors by security, realizing that the man she had paraded around as her ultimate status symbol had just publicly discarded her to save his own skin. The cognitive dissonance was too much for her fragile reality to bear. Her perfect country club world was incinerating around her. She pivoted sharply. The rage and humiliation she could not unleash on Trent found a new familiar target. She turned completely on our parents. "This is your fault," Chloe screamed, pointing a shaking finger directly at Desmond and Patricia. "You promised me this was handled. You promised me the estate lawyers had sanitized the trust fund and that Zoya was permanently erased from the financial records. You told me Trent's company was secure. You ruined my life." The guests watched in horrified fascination as the golden child actively tore her own parents to shreds. The polished elite facade of the Jefferson family was gone, replaced by the vicious reality of thieves turning on each other the second the loot vanished. "Do not you dare raise your voice to me, Chloe," Patricia shrieked, her hands flying up to her perfectly styled hair in a frantic gesture. "We did everything for you. We risked federal prison to pay for your $1 million wedding. We bought your custom-built mansion because your useless husband could not generate a single dime of actual revenue. We sacrificed everything to give you the lifestyle you demanded." "You did not sacrifice anything," Chloe fired back, her voice cracking hysterically. "You stole it from her." She pointed a jagged acrylic nail at me. "You stole her money because Dad bankrupted his real estate firm, and you were too embarrassed to sell this house and admit to your wealthy friends that you were broke. You used me as a prop to pretend we were still royalty in this city. And now I am going to lose everything because you two were too stupid to cover your tracks." The accusation hit the room like a physical shockwave. The wealthy politicians and hospital administrators who had been sipping my parents' expensive wine just an hour ago were now actively backing away from the table. They were pulling out their phones, quietly texting their public relations managers to distance themselves from the Jefferson family name before the scandal hit the morning news cycle. Desmond slammed his hands onto the table, leaning aggressively toward his wife. His face was a mask of pure, unfiltered panic and rage. He needed someone to blame, and Patricia was sitting right next to him. "She is right," Desmond roared at my mother, completely ignoring the audience watching their demise. "This is entirely your fault, Patricia. I told you to shred the physical copies of the wire transfers. I told you to incinerate the secondary death certificate filings after the endowment board processed the trust release. But you had to keep the paper trail. You had to use the direct routing numbers to pay for your country club memberships and your designer clothes because you could not wait 30 days for the accounts to clear the offshore wash. I kept the records because I knew you would try to pin the fraud on me if the federal agents ever came knocking." Patricia screamed right back at him, her pearl necklace swinging wildly against her chest. "You are the one who forged the signature in the rural county court, Desmond. You are the one who bribed the local magistrate to expedite the processing. Do not you dare try to put this entirely on my shoulders. I will not go down for your reckless arrogance. I will testify against you." Desmond threatened, his voice dropping into a vicious snarl. I will tell the district attorney that this entire scheme was your idea to maintain your social standing. I will hand them the offshore account numbers myself in exchange for immunity. You arrogant fool! Patricia laughed, a sharp, hysterical sound that bordered on genuine madness. You cannot negotiate immunity when you are the primary beneficiary of the stolen assets. You think your high-powered lawyers can save you now. You paid their retainers with Zoya's money. Every single dollar you have spent in the last 5 years is fruit of the poisonous tree. You are destitute, Desmond. You are nothing. I stood quietly near the head of the table, watching the fire I had ignited consume the room. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to hurl insults or defend my own humanity against their cruelty. They were doing the work for me. The foundation of lies they had built their entire identity upon was collapsing under the crushing weight of its own corruption. The parents who had told me I was a worthless failure were now publicly confessing to federal crimes just to spite each other. The sister who had poured toxic bleach onto my grandmother's vintage blazer to sabotage my future was now a hysterical, weeping mess, realizing her entire life was a fabricated illusion. The brother-in-law who had mocked my intelligence was pinned against a mahogany door facing years in a federal penitentiary for corporate embezzlement. It was a symphony of absolute destruction. Every vicious comment they had ever made to me, every time they told me I was not smart enough or polished enough or worthy enough to belong in their world. It all dissolved into the pathetic reality playing out before my eyes. They were not elite. They were not brilliant tacticians. They were just common thieves wearing very expensive suits. Mr. Sterling calmly retrieved a sleek silver smartphone from his jacket pocket. He dialed a number, keeping his eyes locked on the chaotic screaming match happening between my mother and father. Send the authorities to the Jefferson estate in Buckhead. Mr. Sterling said, his voice cutting cleanly through the noise of the room. We have multiple confessions to federal wire fraud, grand larceny, and corporate embezzlement happening in real time. Tell the Financial Crimes Division to bring a very large transport vehicle. Patricia heard the word authorities and completely lost the remaining shreds of her composure. She lunged across the table, grabbing Desmond by the collar of his custom-tailored shirt, screaming that he had ruined her life. Desmond shoved her backward, knocking over a towering centerpiece of white orchids. The heavy crystal vase shattered across the mahogany wood, sending water and crushed flowers spilling onto the floor. I reached under my plain black uniform apron and smoothed my hand over the unblemished top half of my grandmother's blazer. I felt the heavy silk lining resting against my skin, a warm protective shield that had carried me through the darkest decade of my life. I watched the empire burn to ash, feeling nothing but the clean, sharp air of total, absolute freedom. I stood back and watched the empire of lies burn to the ground. The dining room was completely unrecognizable from the pristine showcase it had been an hour ago. Smashed crystal littered the Persian rug. The heavy scent of spilled wine and crushed orchids filled the air. The elite guests had completely evacuated the space, slipping out the front doors, the second Mr. Sterling unlocked them, desperate to distance themselves from the impending criminal fallout. It was just me, my sister, and the two people who had brought me into this world only to treat me like a disposable asset. You have exactly 24 hours to vacate my property, I announced. My voice was calm, cutting cleanly through the sound of my mother sobbing on the floor. Patricia looked up at me. The flawless matriarch of Atlanta society was gone. Her mascara was smeared down her cheeks, her expensive silk blouse wrinkled and stained with water from the shattered vase. She scrambled forward on her hands and knees, the sheer desperation stripping away her pride. She reached out and grabbed the hem of my plain black uniform dress, her fingers digging into the fabric like a drowning woman grasping at a lifeline. Zoya, please, Patricia wailed, her voice cracking into a ragged, pathetic sob. You cannot do this to us. We are your parents. We gave you life. We raised you. You cannot just throw us out onto the street. I looked down at the woman who had spent 32 years actively trying to diminish my spirit. I felt absolutely nothing for her. No pity, no sadness, just the cool, solid certainty that I was finally free. I stepped back firmly, pulling the fabric of my dress out of her desperate grasp. And you stole my future, I said softly, looking down at her. You stole my grandmother's legacy, and you stole 5 years of my life to fund your own vanity. You told me I was a failure while you literally fed off my brilliance. I reached into the pocket of my uniform dress. My fingers found the crisp paper I had been carrying since yesterday morning. I pulled out the exact $50 bill my father had slid across the marble kitchen counter when they ruined my grandmother's blazer. I let the bill slip from my fingers. It fluttered down, landing gently on the floor right in front of my mother's tear-stained face. "Here is $50, I said, my voice echoing in the empty, shattered dining room. "Go buy something at Target." I turned my back on them and walked out the front doors, breathing in the cool night air. The distant sound of sirens was already wailing over the Atlanta skyline, growing louder by the second. The next morning was a spectacle of absolute, undeniable justice. Valerie had not just sent the evidence to the district attorney, she had hand-delivered a bulletproof federal case directly to the White-Collar Crime Division. By 7 in the morning, a fleet of black sport utility vehicles and marked police cruisers breached the wrought iron gates of the Buckhead estate. I stood safely near the guest house with Valerie by my side, watching the raid unfold. Federal agents swarmed the property, seizing financial records, computers, and luxury vehicles. Desmond and Patricia Jefferson were led out the front doors of the mansion in handcuffs. There was no dignity left. News helicopters hovered overhead, broadcasting their arrest live to the entire city. My father looked broken, his shoulders slumped as an agent guided him into the back of a federal vehicle. I was facing charges of grand larceny, wire fraud, and tax evasion. His high society friends were nowhere to be found. Trent did not fare any better. The authorities intercepted my arrogant brother-in-law at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport just 2 hours later. I was frantically trying to board a one-way flight to the Cayman Islands with a duffel bag full of cash. He was tackled on the tarmac, screaming that he was a victim of circumstance, completely stripped of his tech visionary disguise. And Chloe was left with absolutely nothing. The federal courts immediately froze all of her bank accounts, categorizing her assets as the proceeds of criminal fraud. The custom-built mansion Trent had bought her was seized before noon. I watched my golden child sister, the woman who had never worked a day in her life, drag a single designer suitcase down the driveway of her seized property. She was forced to check into a cheap extended-stay motel by the highway. Her influencer lifestyle, her massive social media following, and her entire identity were instantly obliterated. She was finally forced to face the real world without a stolen trust fund to protect her. 1 year later, the Georgia sun was shining brightly over a completely revitalized block in one of Atlanta's most historically disadvantaged neighborhoods. The air was filled with the sound of cheering, upbeat music and the joyful chatter of a community coming together. I stood at the top of the wide, welcoming steps of a beautifully constructed, state-of-the-art medical facility. The bold, gleaming letters above the entrance read, "The Dr. Josephine Jefferson Free Clinic." The clinic was fully funded by the $15 million trust I had rightfully reclaimed, bolstered by the liquid assets seized from the sale of my parents' estate. It was a facility dedicated to providing top-tier accessible autoimmune care and diagnostics to the Black community, ensuring that my grandmother's genius actually served the people she cared about most. I was no longer wearing a plain black servant uniform. I was wearing a crisp, pristine white doctor's coat. Beneath it, I wore a brand new, perfectly tailored navy wool blazer. It was a deliberate, joyful nod to the past, a symbol that they had failed to bleach out my worth. I had completed my first year of the Accelerated Clinical Residency program at the Atlanta Medical Institute, thriving in an environment where my intelligence was finally celebrated rather than suppressed. I looked at the people standing beside me. Valerie looked sharp and victorious in a stunning crimson suit, her legal brilliance having secured the clinic's nonprofit status. Dr. Harrison stood on my other side, beaming with profound paternal pride. He had become the mentor and guide my own father refused to be. They were my chosen family, a circle of support built on mutual respect, honesty, and shared ambition. A local journalist stepped forward, holding out a microphone, as someone handed me a pair of large ceremonial golden scissors. "Dr. Jefferson," the journalist asked, using my rightful title, "what does this moment mean to you, bringing your grandmother's legacy back to life after so many obstacles?" I looked out at the vibrant, smiling faces of the community gathered on the lawn. I thought about the dark, lonely nights in the hospital lab, the stinging smell of bleach, and the terrified girl who had once believed she was nothing but a family disappointment. That girl was gone. It means that the truth always finds the light. I said, my voice strong, clear, and completely full of joy. It means that you can try to bury a legacy, but if the foundation is built on excellence, it will always rise again. I smiled, feeling the warmth of the sun on my face. I brought the golden scissors together and cut the bright red ribbon. The crowd erupted into applause. I had lost a toxic, manipulative family, but in the end I had gained an empire. And this time I built it entirely on my own terms. Looking back on the day I walked out of that dining room, I realized the most profound lesson of my life. For over 3 decades, I was conditioned to believe that family loyalty meant silently absorbing abuse, shrinking myself to protect their egos, and allowing my brilliance to be sidelined, just to keep the peace. But blood does not give anyone the right to steal your future or diminish your worth. The hardest truth to accept was that the people who should have protected my legacy were the very ones trying to bury it. By reclaiming my grandmother's trust and building a clinic for our community, I learned that true power isn't about matching their cruelty, it's about matching your actions with your true purpose. You are completely allowed to walk away from tables where respect is no longer being served. Sometimes, the most beautiful empires are built from the ashes of the toxic bridges you finally decided to burn. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with toxic relatives to protect your own peace and future? How did you find the courage to finally choose yourself? Share your story in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit that like button, subscribe, and share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that their worth is absolutely non-negotiable.